October 12, 1962. Naval Research Laboratory, Washington, D.C. The meeting had dragged on for over 3 hours, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Commander Robert Lawrence sat motionless as the final decision came down from Admiral Harrington. The project was officially terminated. 17 years of work, countless sleepless nights, millions in funding, all ended with a single signature. As the room emptied, Lawrence remained seated, staring at the stack of research files stamped classified. The Admiral paused at the door. "I'm sorry, Bob. Your concept is simply too destabilizing. The Navy can't support a weapon that makes our entire fleet obsolete." The door closed with a soft click that somehow sounded like thunder. What the admirals and politicians didn't understand was that Lawrence wasn't proposing a weapon. He was describing an inevitability. The mathematics couldn't be legislated away. The physics wouldn't bow to naval tradition. He had glimpsed the future of warfare, a future where massive capital ships would become vulnerable targets, where naval supremacy could be challenged by nations with a fraction of America's industrial capacity. And that future was coming, whether they funded his research or not. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Robert Lawrence was born in 1917 in Cambridge, Massachusetts, the son of a physics professor at MIT. From an early age, he displayed an uncanny ability with mathematics and a curiosity about the physical world that bordered on obsession. While other children built model airplanes, young Robert built working seismographs and primitive radar sets. His father's colleagues would often find him in the university library, poring over graduate-level physics journals, taking meticulous notes in a series of leather-bound notebooks that he carried everywhere. In 1939, Lawrence graduated from MIT with dual degrees in physics and electrical engineering. His thesis on electromagnetic wave propagation in saline solutions caught the attention of the Office of Naval Research, which was quietly recruiting the brightest scientific minds as war loomed in Europe. By December 1941, Lawrence was commissioned as a lieutenant in the Navy and assigned to a classified research unit focused on submarine detection technologies. His wartime experiences would plant the seed for his later work. Stationed briefly in the Atlantic, Lawrence witnessed firsthand the devastating effectiveness of German U-boats against Allied shipping. He was struck by the fundamental asymmetry. Small, relatively inexpensive submarines could destroy massive capital ships and merchant vessels with minimal risk. This strategic imbalance fascinated him. "The history of warfare has always been a pendulum swing between offense and defense," he wrote in a 1943 memo that would later prove prophetic. "When one side gains dominance through a particular weapon system, the other inevitably develops a countermeasure."
The atomic bomb crystallized something in Lawrence's thinking. Here was a weapon that had changed the entire calculus of warfare overnight. But what struck him most wasn't the bomb's destructive power, it was its precision. For the first time in history, a weapon could be delivered with enough accuracy to destroy a specific target with a single strike. After the war, Lawrence remained with the Navy, turning down lucrative offers from emerging defense contractors. He was assigned to the newly formed Naval Research Laboratory in Washington, where he assembled a small team focused on advanced weapons concepts. Their official mandate was exploring applications of nuclear weapons to naval warfare. Their unofficial work would prove far more revolutionary. Lawrence's insights began with a simple observation. Naval warfare had always been limited by the accuracy of weapons delivery. Even the most powerful battleship guns couldn't reliably hit targets beyond the horizon. Aircraft improved this capability, but were vulnerable to interception. What was needed was a weapon that combined the power of an aircraft's payload with pinpoint accuracy and invulnerability to defensive measures. His first breakthrough came in 1949 while reviewing data on the German V-2 rocket program. The Germans had created a ballistic missile capable of striking targets hundreds of miles away. While wildly inaccurate by modern standards, Lawrence recognized that with sufficient guidance systems, such weapons could revolutionize naval warfare. If a missile could be made accurate enough to target a moving ship, he wrote in his research journal, the entire paradigm of naval power would be upended overnight. A nation wouldn't need a navy to control the seas. It would only need the ability to deny that control to others. This concept, what would later be called anti-access area denial, was considered heretical in naval circles. The Navy's entire strategic doctrine was built around carrier battle groups projecting power across the globe. Lawrence was suggesting that relatively inexpensive land-based missiles could neutralize these massive investments. His team began working on the guidance problem in earnest. How could a missile locate and track a moving target at sea? Early computer systems were far too bulky for missile applications. Radar guidance could be jammed. Lawrence needed something revolutionary. The inspiration came from an unlikely source. In 1952, Lawrence attended a demonstration of a new sonar system being developed for submarine detection. The system used a form of acoustic pattern matching to distinguish submarine signatures from other underwater sounds. Lawrence immediately recognized the potential application to his missile guidance problem. What if, he proposed to his team the next day, we created an optical recognition system that could identify ship types based on their visual signature? A missile with such a system could not only hit a ship, it could selectively target the most valuable vessel in a group. The concept was decades ahead of its time. Modern image recognition and artificial intelligence would eventually make such systems commonplace, but in the early 1950s, it seemed like science fiction. Nevertheless, Lawrence's team began developing a primitive version using analog computing techniques. By 1954, they had created a rudimentary prototype. The Pattern Matching Optical Recognition System, or PMORS, could distinguish between basic ship silhouettes with about 70% accuracy. It was crude, but proved the concept was viable.
Lawrence's work caught the attention of Admiral James Holloway, then Director of Naval Operations. Holloway visited the laboratory in November 1954 and received a full briefing on the anti-ship missile concept. His reaction was a mixture of awe and alarm. "Dr. Lawrence," Holloway said after the presentation, "do you realize what you're proposing? This weapon would make our carriers vulnerable to attack from any nation with the technology to build it. It could completely upend the balance of naval power." Lawrence's response was characteristically blunt. "With respect, Admiral, I'm not proposing anything. I'm merely identifying an inevitable technological development. If we don't build it, someone else will. The mathematics and physics don't change based on who discovers them first." This exchange encapsulated the dilemma Lawrence's work presented to Navy leadership. On one hand, developing such weapons would give America a significant advantage. On the other, as the world's dominant naval power, the United States had the most to lose from technologies that threatened large surface vessels. Despite reservations, Holloway authorized continued funding for what was now codenamed Project Trident. Lawrence's team expanded to include experts in rocketry, electronics, and materials science. They established a test facility at Point Mugu Naval Air Station in California, where they could conduct live-fire exercises against decommissioned ships. The first tests in 1956 were promising, but revealed significant challenges. The missiles could hit stationary targets with reasonable accuracy, but moving targets proved elusive. The guidance systems struggled with changing light conditions and couldn't function at night or in poor weather. Lawrence was undeterred. He recruited specialists in the emerging field of infrared detection, which could overcome many of these limitations. By 1958, his team had developed a dual-mode guidance system that combined optical recognition with infrared tracking. Test results improved dramatically. In a classified demonstration in August 1958, a Trident prototype successfully struck a moving target ship from 75 miles away. The dummy warhead hit within 10 feet of the bridge, precise enough that with a real warhead, it would have been a kill shot against any vessel afloat. The successful test should have been cause for celebration, but Lawrence noticed a change in the program's oversight. Naval officers who had enthusiastically supported the project now seemed guarded. Funding allocations that had once been routine began facing increased scrutiny. Technical reports were classified at higher security levels, restricting their distribution even within the defense establishment. Lawrence first attributed these changes to security concerns. Trident was, after all, a potentially game-changing weapon system. But a chance conversation with a Pentagon official in early 1959 revealed the truth. The Navy's leadership had become deeply uncomfortable with Trident's implications. "You've created a weapon that threatens the cornerstone of our naval strategy," the official told Lawrence privately. "The carrier battle group represents the largest single investment in our defense budget. Your missile suggests that investment might be obsolete." This revelation struck Lawrence like a physical blow. He had always seen himself as serving his country's interests, creating technologies that would maintain American military superiority. The idea that his work might be suppressed for bureaucratic or budgetary reasons seemed unconscionable.
He redoubled his efforts, driving his team harder and expanding the scope of their research. If Trident faced resistance for threatening carriers, he would develop variants for other applications: anti-submarine warfare, land attack, even air defense. He hoped that by demonstrating the technology's versatility, he could overcome institutional resistance. By early 1960, Trident had evolved into a family of missile systems with various specialized guidance packages. The most advanced version, Trident D, incorporated early microprocessors and could differentiate between ship classes with 90% accuracy. It could strike targets at ranges exceeding 200 miles, outranging any naval gun or carrier aircraft of the era. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Lawrence's crowning achievement came in March 1960 during a classified naval exercise in the Pacific. A Trident D missile was launched from San Clemente Island toward a task force centered around the USS Constellation, 120 miles offshore. The missile was programmed to identify the carrier within the battle group, avoid defensive measures, and strike with a dummy warhead. The exercise did not go as planned. It exceeded all expectations. Not only did the missile successfully identify and target the Constellation, but it also evaded every defensive measure deployed against it. The simulated impact point was directly amidships, which would have been catastrophic with a live warhead. More concerning to naval observers, the missile had approached at wave-top height, making it nearly invisible to radar until the final approach. Admiral Richard Anderson, who observed the test, later wrote in a classified assessment, "Lawrence's weapon represents the most significant threat to surface naval operations since the advent of the submarine. A peer competitor armed with this technology could effectively neutralize our carrier advantage without needing to build a competing fleet." This assessment reached the highest levels of the Pentagon and eventually the National Security Council. The implications were profound. America's naval strategy since World War II had been built around carrier battle groups projecting power globally. Trident suggested that strategy might be fundamentally flawed. Debate raged through the summer and fall of 1960. Lawrence was summoned to Washington repeatedly to brief military leaders and defense officials. His presentations were technical and dispassionate, focusing on capabilities rather than strategic implications. But privately, he understood exactly what his creation meant. "We have spent billions building floating airfields that can project power anywhere in the world," he wrote in his journal. "I have demonstrated that a nation could spend millions, not billions, on missiles that could sink those airfields. The mathematics are inescapable." The Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962 brought matters to a head. As American carriers positioned themselves for a potential blockade, intelligence suggested the Soviets might have deployed early anti-ship missiles to Cuba. The crisis passed without these weapons being used, but the mere possibility sent shockwaves through naval planning circles. 1 month later, on November 15, 1962, Lawrence was summoned to a meeting at the Pentagon. Present were the Chief of Naval Operations, the Secretary of the Navy, and representatives from the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA. The message was clear. Trident was being terminated as an active weapons program.
Yesterday, Richards replied. 2 weeks later, Lawrence walked into a nondescript office building in Arlington, Virginia. His new workplace, the Special Projects Division of DARPA, occupied the entire 5th floor. The security was extraordinary, with multiple checkpoints and armed guards. Whatever was happening here clearly carried the highest national priority. Inside, Lawrence was surprised to find several familiar faces. Key members of his Trident team had been quietly transferred to this new division. Among them was Dr. James Chen, his brilliant guidance systems engineer, and Commander William Hayes, his former Navy liaison. "Welcome to Project Aegis," Hayes said, using the program's new codename. "You'll find we've been busy since the official termination of Trident." It quickly became apparent that Trident hadn't actually been canceled. It had been transformed. Rather than developing an American anti-ship missile, the focus had shifted to understanding how potential adversaries might create similar weapons and how to counter them. Lawrence was given access to intelligence reports suggesting the Soviets were actively working on similar concepts. Their approach was cruder, focusing on radar guidance rather than optical recognition, but the underlying principle was the same. A missile could potentially threaten even the largest surface vessels at standoff ranges that made defense extremely difficult. The ONI assessment is that they're 5 to 7 years from operational deployment, Hayes said, referring to the Office of Naval Intelligence. "Our job is to ensure that when they field these weapons, we're ready." Lawrence threw himself into this new challenge with characteristic intensity. If his offensive weapon had been revolutionary, the defensive countermeasures would need to be equally innovative. Traditional naval defenses, anti-aircraft guns, interceptor aircraft, and electronic jamming were designed for known threats. Anti-ship missiles presented an entirely new category of problem. His team established a systematic approach to the challenge. First, they would fully model the threat, creating detailed simulations of how Soviet anti-ship missiles might perform. Next, they would evaluate existing defensive systems against these models to identify vulnerabilities. Finally, they would develop new technologies specifically designed to counter this emerging threat. The modeling work was straightforward for Lawrence. He already understood the physics of the problem intimately. He had, after all, solved it once before from the offensive perspective. His team created increasingly sophisticated simulations of Soviet missiles, incorporating intelligence about their radar systems, propulsion technologies, and manufacturing capabilities. What emerged was concerning. Even with relatively primitive guidance systems, Soviet missiles could pose a significant threat to American carrier groups. The physics and mathematics that had driven Lawrence's original insights applied regardless of specific implementation details. "The fundamental problem remains unchanged," he explained during a briefing to naval leadership in March 1963. A missile traveling at high subsonic or supersonic speeds presents a compressed timeline for detection, identification, and interception. At sea level, radar horizon limitations mean detection may occur only 20 to 30 seconds before impact. Our existing defensive systems simply cannot react quickly enough.
The room fell silent as the implications sank in. America's carrier-centric naval strategy, the cornerstone of its global power projection, faced a potentially existential threat. Admiral Thomas Moorer, then Deputy Chief of Naval Operations, asked the question everyone was thinking. Can these weapons be effectively countered, Dr. Lawrence? Yes, Lawrence replied without hesitation, but not with existing systems or doctrines. We need a layered defense approach with multiple independent systems working in concert. Most importantly, we need automation. Human reaction times are simply too slow for this threat environment. This assessment led to the second phase of Project Aegis, evaluating existing systems. Lawrence's team conducted exhaustive simulations, testing every defensive weapon and sensor in the Navy's inventory against modeled missile threats. The results were uniformly disappointing. Conventional anti-aircraft guns lacked the range and accuracy needed. Interceptor aircraft could potentially engage incoming missiles, but required advance warning that might not be available. Electronic countermeasures showed some promise, but could be overcome by basic guidance improvements. Most concerning was the human element. From detection to defensive response typically required multiple decision points by different personnel. This command and control structure, while necessary for avoiding fratricidal incidents and managing limited resources, introduced delays that could prove fatal against supersonic missiles. Lawrence presented these findings at the Pentagon in June 1963. The briefing was tense, with several admirals openly challenging his methodology and conclusions. "You're suggesting our entire defensive doctrine is obsolete," one rear admiral objected, "based on a threat that doesn't exist yet." Lawrence's response was measured but firm. The threat doesn't exist in deployed form, but the physics exists. The mathematics exists. The engineering challenges are solvable with current technology. We must assume our adversaries can solve the same equations we can. Despite resistance, Project Aegis received expanded funding and priority. Lawrence was authorized to begin the third phase, developing new defensive technologies specifically designed for anti-ship missile threats. His approach was revolutionary. Rather than designing individual weapons or sensors, he conceived of an integrated combat system that would link multiple defensive layers through automated command and control. Human operators would supervise rather than directly control moment-to-moment responses. "We need to compress the detection to engagement timeline," he explained to his team. "That means automating the decision loop while maintaining human oversight of the overall system." The conceptual breakthrough came in August 1963 during a late-night session in his office. He had been reviewing radar detection limitations when inspiration struck. If radar horizon constraints meant limited warning time, the solution wasn't faster reactions, it was earlier detection. Lawrence sketched a concept for what he called a combat information center that would integrate data from multiple platforms, ships, aircraft, and eventually satellites. This networked approach could extend detection ranges far beyond what any single vessel could achieve. The key insight is that we don't need to outrun physics. We need to change the battlefield geometry.
By networking sensors across multiple platforms, we create a detection envelope that extends far beyond any single vessel's horizon. This concept, revolutionary at the time, would eventually evolve into modern networked warfare. But in 1963, it faced significant technical hurdles. Computer technology was still rudimentary. Data links between platforms were slow and unreliable, and the software engineering required was beyond existing capabilities. Lawrence was undeterred. He assembled a specialized team of computer scientists, communications engineers, and operations research analysts to tackle these challenges. Their work would pioneer many concepts that later became standard in military and civilian computing: distributed processing, redundant communications, and automated decision support. By early 1964, Project Aegis had produced preliminary designs for what would eventually become the Aegis Combat System. The concept centered around a new phased-array radar that could track multiple targets simultaneously, linked to advanced computers that could automatically prioritize threats and direct appropriate defensive weapons. Lawrence's vision extended beyond hardware. He recognized that defeating anti-ship missiles required fundamental changes to naval tactics and doctrine. In April 1964, he organized a series of war games at the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island, incorporating simulated Soviet missile capabilities into fleet exercises. The results were sobering. Traditional carrier battle group formations proved highly vulnerable to simulated missile salvos. Even with Lawrence's proposed defensive systems, losses were significant. But the exercises yielded valuable insights that led to new tactical concepts: dispersed formations, coordinated electronic warfare, and the strategic use of terrain to limit missile effectiveness. Throughout 1964 and 1965, Lawrence divided his time between the technical development of Aegis and educating naval leadership about the changing nature of maritime warfare. He became a regular lecturer at the Naval War College and the Naval Postgraduate School, where his courses on the mathematics of modern naval combat became legendary for their intellectual rigor and strategic insights. Not everyone appreciated his message. Lawrence faced continuing resistance from officers invested in traditional naval doctrine. Aircraft carrier admirals were particularly skeptical of his warnings, seeing them as threats to carrier aviation's primacy in naval warfare. "Lawrence is fighting yesterday's war," one admiral famously remarked. "The Soviet Navy barely exists as a blue water force. They pose no serious threat to our carrier groups." Lawrence's response, documented in a memo that circulated widely through defense circles, became a perfect encapsulation of his philosophy. "I am not fighting yesterday's war or today's war. I am preparing for tomorrow's war, the one defined by mathematical realities rather than current capabilities. Physics doesn't care about our doctrine, and mathematics doesn't respect our traditions." In September 1965, Lawrence received intelligence that would validate his concerns while simultaneously creating a new crisis. Soviet T-95 reconnaissance aircraft had photographed American carrier operations in the Mediterranean with a new high-resolution camera system. Analysts suggested they were gathering precisely the kind of ship signature data needed for the optical recognition systems Lawrence had pioneered with Trident.
More concerning, intercepted communications indicated the Soviets had recently conducted a partially successful test of an anti-ship missile against a moving target in the Black Sea. Their Progress program, NATO designation SSN-2 Styx, appeared to be advancing faster than American intelligence had estimated. Lawrence was summoned to a classified briefing at the CIA headquarters in Langley. The assessment was grim. The Soviets might field an operational anti-ship missile system within 2 years, not the 5 to 7 previously estimated. "It appears they've solved some of the guidance problems more quickly than anticipated," the CIA analyst explained. "Their approach differs from yours. They're using active radar homing rather than optical recognition, but the operational impact is similar." Lawrence wasn't surprised. He had always believed the basic concept was inevitable once the underlying mathematics was understood. What concerned him was the compressed timeline. His Aegis system was still years from operational deployment. In response to this intelligence, Project Aegis received emergency priority status. Funding was doubled, bureaucratic obstacles were removed, and Lawrence was given direct access to the Chief of Naval Operations. What had been a research program became a crash development effort with national security implications. Lawrence worked at a punishing pace through the winter of 1965-66. His health began to deteriorate under the stress. He developed chronic insomnia and lost 20 pounds from his already lean frame. But his intellectual output remained extraordinary. By February 1966, his team had completed the preliminary design for the AN/SPY-1 radar, the heart of the Aegis system. This revolutionary phased array radar could track more than 100 targets simultaneously while conducting continuous surveillance of the surrounding airspace. More importantly, it was designed specifically to detect the low-altitude, high-speed profiles typical of cruise missiles. Lawrence's contributions extended beyond hardware development. He personally wrote much of the initial threat evaluation and weapons assignment algorithms that would form the backbone of the Aegis combat system. These sophisticated mathematical models could assess multiple incoming threats, determine their relative priorities, and allocate defensive resources optimally, all within seconds. In March 1966, Lawrence presented the completed Aegis concept to the highest levels of naval leadership.
His briefing was characteristically rigorous, filled with equations, performance curves, and probability matrices, but his conclusion was expressed in remarkably simple terms. Gentlemen, the era of the unchallenged carrier is ending, but with Aegis, we can ensure the carrier remains viable in the face of these new threats. We cannot change the physics, but we can change how we respond to it. The briefing marked a turning point in naval thinking. For the first time, senior leadership fully grasped both the magnitude of the emerging threat and the potential of Lawrence's solution. Aegis received full developmental funding and was designated as the Navy's highest procurement priority after the Polaris submarine program. As development accelerated, Lawrence faced a personal crossroads. His health continued to deteriorate, and doctors warned that his punishing work schedule was unsustainable. In May 1966, he suffered a minor heart attack that forced a temporary hospitalization. From his hospital bed, Lawrence continued to direct the Aegis program, reviewing technical specifications and solving engineering problems that had stymied his team.
When Admiral Hyman Rickover, himself legendary for driving technological innovation, visited Lawrence in the hospital, he remarked, "I thought I was the only one crazy enough to work this way." Lawrence's reply was telling. "The mathematics doesn't care about my health, Admiral. The physics won't wait for me to recover." Upon his release from the hospital, Lawrence made a difficult decision. He would step back from day-to-day management of Project Aegis, focusing instead on solving the most critical technical problems while training others to implement his vision. This transition was painful for someone who had been intimately involved in every aspect of the program, but it was necessary for both his health and the project's long-term success. In June 1966, Lawrence delivered what became known as the Mathematics of Survival lecture to the incoming team leaders who would carry Aegis forward. The session, recorded for training purposes, provided a remarkable glimpse into Lawrence's thinking. "What we're creating isn't just a weapon system," he told them. "It's a mathematical response to an inevitable physical reality. The equations that make anti-ship missiles possible are written into the fabric of the universe. We can't change them. What we can change is our response to them." He continued, "Every defensive system we design must acknowledge these mathematical realities. Detection ranges are limited by radar horizon. Reaction times are constrained by signal processing speeds. Interception probabilities are governed by relative velocities and guidance accuracies. These aren't engineering problems to be solved, they're physical constraints to be respected." The lecture became required viewing for every engineer and officer who joined the Aegis program over the next decade. Lawrence's emphasis on fundamental physical and mathematical limitations, rather than specific technical solutions, created a problem-solving approach that would allow the system to evolve for generations. As Lawrence stepped back from daily management, his health gradually improved. By late 1966, he had returned to a modified work schedule, focusing on strategic direction rather than tactical implementation. This new role allowed him to think more broadly about the future of naval warfare. In December 1966, he produced a classified paper titled Asymmetric Maritime Strategies in the Missile Age that would profoundly influence American naval thinking. The paper predicted that anti-ship missiles would eventually proliferate to smaller powers, creating scenarios where nations with limited naval forces could threaten even sophisticated fleets. "We are entering an era where the cost ratio between offensive and defensive systems strongly favors the offense. A nation can deploy hundreds of anti-ship missiles for the cost of a single guided missile destroyer. This mathematical reality will reshape maritime strategy more profoundly than any development since the introduction of steam power." This assessment would prove prophetic decades later when nations like China and Iran developed maritime strategies centered around shore-based anti-ship missiles. But in 1966, it represented a paradigm shift in strategic thinking that many naval planners were reluctant to accept.
As 1967 began, Lawrence could see his vision taking concrete form. The first prototype SPY-1 radar components were undergoing testing. The computer systems for threat evaluation and weapons assignment were being coded. The missile interceptors that would form the system's primary defensive capability were in development.
Yet Lawrence remained concerned about the timeline. Intelligence suggested the Soviet Styx missile would enter service by early 1968, while Aegis remained years from operational deployment. This gap created what Lawrence called a window of vulnerability that deeply troubled him. In February 1967, he proposed an interim solution, a simplified version of Aegis that could be deployed more rapidly on existing vessels. This system, later designated the Naval Tactical Data System, or NTDS, would provide rudimentary automated threat processing and weapons coordination using existing sensors and weapons. It won't provide the layered defense or reaction times of the full Aegis system, Lawrence acknowledged, but it represents a substantial improvement over current capabilities and can be deployed within months rather than years. The Navy quickly approved this pragmatic approach. By September 1967, the first NTDS systems were being installed on destroyers assigned to carrier escort duty. Though limited compared to Lawrence's full vision for Aegis, they represented the first operational implementation of his concepts for automated defense against missile threats. In October 1967, these interim systems faced their first real-world test. Soviet Tu-16 bombers, armed with what intelligence identified as early-model Styx missiles, conducted aggressive approaches toward the USS America carrier group operating in the Mediterranean. The NTDS-equipped escorts successfully tracked the potential threat and coordinated a defensive posture that dissuaded the Soviets from pressing their approach. Though no missiles were actually fired, the incident validated Lawrence's core concept. Automated integration of sensors and weapons could substantially improve defensive capabilities against emerging missile threats. More importantly, it demonstrated to skeptical naval leaders that the threat Lawrence had warned about for years was now an operational reality. As 1967 drew to a close, Lawrence received unexpected recognition for his contributions. In a private ceremony at the Pentagon, he was awarded the Distinguished Service Medal, the highest non-combatant decoration awarded by the Department of Defense. The citation acknowledged his visionary leadership in anticipating and addressing emerging threats to naval forces. The recognition was bittersweet for Lawrence. His forbidden idea, the concept that precisely targeted missiles could threaten even the largest surface vessels, had evolved from a career-threatening heresy to an acknowledged reality driving naval planning. But that recognition had come only after potential adversaries had begun developing the very capabilities he had warned about years earlier. At the ceremony, Admiral Thomas Moorer, now Chief of Naval Operations, offered a candid assessment that Lawrence never forgot. "We should have listened to you sooner, Bob. You saw the mathematics more clearly than we did." January 1968. Snow fell heavily outside the windows of the Naval Research Laboratory as Lawrence reviewed the latest intelligence briefing. The Soviets had officially deployed their first operational anti-ship missile system, the SSN-2 Styx, aboard Komar-class missile boats. These small, fast vessels now carried weapons capable of threatening ships many times their size and cost. It was the mathematical asymmetry Lawrence had predicted years earlier, now manifested in steel and electronics. More concerning was evidence that the Soviets were preparing to export this technology to client states. Egypt had reportedly received several Komar boats equipped with Styx missiles. Intelligence suggested Syria and Algeria might be next. The proliferation Lawrence had warned about was beginning faster than anyone had anticipated. Admiral Moorer called an emergency meeting of the Navy's senior leadership at the Pentagon. Lawrence was invited not just as a technical expert, but as the one person who had most accurately predicted the current situation. The atmosphere was tense as Lawrence entered the conference room. Gone was the skepticism that had once greeted his warnings. Now these hardened naval officers looked to him for solutions. "Gentlemen," Moorer began, "the threat Dr. Lawrence identified years ago is now an operational reality. The Soviets have deployed Styx missiles that can strike our vessels from beyond visual range.
More concerning, they're providing this capability to nations that previously posed no serious naval threat. We need to accelerate our countermeasures immediately. Lawrence listened as various admirals proposed crash programs for electronic countermeasures, accelerated destroyer construction, and enhanced carrier air defenses. When his turn came to speak, he approached the situation with characteristic directness. These are all necessary steps, he acknowledged, but they represent incremental improvements to existing capabilities. What we're facing is not an incremental threat, it's a fundamental shift in the nature of naval warfare. The mathematics hasn't changed since I first presented it to this group 5 years ago. What has changed is that our adversaries have now solved the same equations. He continued, Aegis remains our best long-term solution, but it won't be fully operational for at least 5 years. In the interim, we need to adopt new tactics and operational concepts that acknowledge this new reality. Lawrence proposed what he called distributed lethality, a concept decades ahead of its time. Rather than concentrating naval power in vulnerable carrier groups, he suggested dispersing capabilities across multiple smaller platforms while maintaining networked coordination. This approach would present potential adversaries with too many targets to effectively neutralize while preserving offensive capabilities. The carrier will remain important, he explained, but we must stop thinking of it as the centerpiece around which everything else revolves. In a world of precision anti-ship missiles, concentration creates vulnerability. Distribution creates resilience. The concept was revolutionary and met with significant resistance. Carrier admirals saw it as a direct threat to their platform's primacy. Surface warfare officers worried about the operational complexities of coordinating dispersed forces. Logisticians questioned the practicality of supporting widely distributed naval groups. Lawrence addressed each concern methodically, always returning to the underlying mathematics. The equations don't care about our traditions or preferences, he repeated. They describe physical realities that we must acknowledge and adapt to. By the meeting's end, no consensus had been reached on Lawrence's distributed lethality concept, but Aegis received emergency acceleration. Additional funding was approved, bureaucratic obstacles were removed, and the first test platform, the USS Norton Sound, was designated for conversion to validate the Aegis concept.
Lawrence's radar and computer systems. As Lawrence left the Pentagon that evening, Admiral Zumwalt, then serving as Chief of Naval Operations for Surface Warfare, stopped him in the hallway. "That was quite a performance, Bob," Zumwalt said. "You've managed to terrify the entire Admiralty." "Not my intention," Lawrence replied. "I'm just following the mathematics where it leads." "The mathematics may be clear to you," Zumwalt said, "but for the rest of us, it represents the end of everything we've built our careers around. You're asking the Navy to fundamentally reimagine itself based on a threat that hasn't yet been demonstrated in combat." Lawrence's response was prophetic. "The demonstration is coming, Admiral. I can't tell you when or where, but the equations guarantee it. The only question is whether we'll have adapted before it happens." That demonstration would come sooner than anyone anticipated. On October 21, 1967, the Israeli destroyer Eilat was patrolling off Port Said, Egypt. At 5:30 p.m., Egyptian missile boats launched 4 Styx missiles. The Eilat, lacking any effective countermeasures against this new threat, was struck by 3 of them. She sank within minutes, with the loss of 47 sailors. The Eilat incident sent shockwaves through the naval establishment worldwide. It represented the first time in history that a warship had been sunk by a guided missile fired from another ship. More significantly, the attacking vessels were small, inexpensive missile boats that had destroyed a destroyer many times their size and cost. Lawrence received the intelligence report on the Eilat sinking with a complex mixture of emotions. On one hand, it validated everything he had been warning about for years. On the other, it represented the loss of human lives that might have been prevented had his warnings been heeded earlier.
He immediately drafted a detailed analysis of the incident, highlighting specific aspects that confirmed his theoretical predictions. The missile's sea-skimming approach had defeated conventional radar detection. The compressed timeline between detection and impact had prevented effective defensive measures. The devastating effect of even a single hit demonstrated the fundamental vulnerability of surface vessels to precision missiles. Lawrence's analysis was circulated throughout the naval establishment with unprecedented urgency. Overnight, the Pentagon's priorities shifted. Aegis moved from an important development program to an existential necessity. The interim countermeasures Lawrence had recommended, improved electronic warfare, decoy systems, and tactical modifications, were rushed into production. In January 1969, Lawrence was appointed special advisor to the Chief of Naval Operations with a mandate to accelerate not just Aegis, but a comprehensive approach to the anti-ship missile threat. He assembled a diverse team that included not just engineers and scientists, but tacticians, intelligence analysts, and even historians studying how navies had adapted to previous technological revolutions. This integrated approach yielded important insights. Lawrence recognized that no single technology could address the missile threat completely. What was needed was a layered defense, combining multiple systems with complementary capabilities. The mathematics of missile defense is ultimately probabilistic, he explained in a briefing to naval commanders in March 1969.
No single system can guarantee 100% effectiveness, but by combining multiple independent systems, each with different strengths and weaknesses, we can achieve acceptable protection even against sophisticated threats. This concept, layered defense, became the cornerstone of naval missile defense for decades to come. It acknowledged the reality Lawrence had identified years earlier. The physics and mathematics fundamentally favored offensive missiles over defensive systems. The only viable approach was to deploy multiple defensive layers, each reducing the probability of successful attack until the cumulative effect provided adequate protection. Throughout 1969, Lawrence divided his time between the technical development of Aegis and educating naval leadership about the changing nature of maritime warfare. He established what became known as the Lawrence Seminars, intensive 2-week courses for senior officers focusing on the mathematical and physical realities of modern naval combat. These seminars proved transformative for many participants. Officers who had spent careers in traditional naval operations were suddenly confronted with the cold equations that Lawrence had been wrestling with for years. Many emerged with fundamentally changed perspectives on naval warfare and the role of technology in maritime strategy. Admiral James Holloway, who would later serve as Chief of Naval Operations, described the experience. Lawrence didn't just teach us about specific weapons or tactics. He taught us how to think about naval warfare as a mathematical problem, one where physics and probability theory mattered more than tradition or doctrine. It was a completely new paradigm for most of us. As development of Aegis accelerated, Lawrence maintained his focus on the big picture. He understood that the system's technical specifications were less important than its conceptual foundation. The integration of sensors, computers, and weapons into a unified defensive system capable of addressing multiple threats simultaneously. This holistic approach extended beyond hardware. Lawrence recognized that human factors would ultimately determine Aegis's effectiveness. He insisted that operator training and human-machine interfaces receive as much attention as radar performance or missile capabilities. The most sophisticated system in the world is useless if operators don't understand its capabilities and limitations, he noted in a 1970 memo. We need to design Aegis not just as a collection of technologies, but as a complete system that includes the human operators as essential components. This human-centered approach represented a significant departure from previous weapons development programs.
Lawrence insisted that actual naval operators be involved in every stage of Aegis's design, ensuring the system would be usable under the stress and chaos of actual combat. By mid-1970, the first major components of Aegis were ready for testing. The SPY-1 radar prototype was installed aboard the USS Norton Sound, a converted seaplane tender designated as the Navy's missile test ship. Initial trials exceeded expectations. The radar could detect and track targets at ranges far beyond existing systems and could maintain tracks on multiple targets simultaneously. The computer systems proved more challenging. The algorithms Lawrence had developed for threat evaluation and weapons assignment required more processing power than available computers could provide. Lawrence worked closely with IBM and UNIVAC engineers to develop custom hardware that could execute his mathematical models in real time. Despite technical challenges, the program maintained its momentum. By early 1971, the Norton Sound was conducting integrated tests of the radar, computing, and weapons components of Aegis. The results validated Lawrence's fundamental concept. Automated integration of sensors and weapons could dramatically improve defensive capabilities against missile threats. In May 1971, Lawrence organized a demonstration for congressional leadership and senior Pentagon officials. The Norton Sound, operating off San Clemente Island, would defend against simultaneous attacks from multiple aircraft and cruise missile simulators. The demonstration was deliberately designed to exceed the capabilities of conventional defensive systems. As observers watched from the ship's Combat Information Center, the SPY-1 radar tracked 16 incoming targets simultaneously, a feat impossible with traditional systems. The Aegis computers evaluated each threat, assigned appropriate defensive weapons, and coordinated their employment without human intervention. 14 of the 16 simulated threats were neutralized before they could reach their target. The demonstration transformed Aegis from an experimental program to a procurement priority. Congress approved full funding for what would become the Navy's primary surface combatant for the next half-century. The first dedicated Aegis cruiser, the USS Ticonderoga, was authorized, with plans for an entire class of similar vessels. For Lawrence, the program's success brought both validation and reflection. He had spent nearly 2 decades warning about a threat that many had dismissed, then developing a solution that many had considered unnecessary. Now that solution was becoming the backbone of American naval defense strategy. In September 1971, Lawrence was invited to address the graduating class at the Naval Academy in Annapolis. His speech, later published as The Mathematics of Survival in the Missile Age, offered a rare public glimpse into his thinking about technology, warfare, and adaptation. The history of warfare, he told the midshipmen, is largely a history of technological revolutions and institutional responses to them. Those militaries that accurately assess new technologies and adapt quickly tend to prevail. Those that cling to outdated doctrines and technologies tend to fail, often catastrophically. He continued, "What makes our current moment unique is the pace of technological change. Previous revolutions, gunpowder, steam power, and radio communication, unfolded over decades or centuries. Today's revolutions occur within years or even months. The mathematical reality is that adaptation must occur at least as rapidly as innovation, or vulnerability becomes inevitable."
As 1972 began, Lawrence faced a new challenge. The Soviets had deployed their second-generation anti-ship missile, the SSN-3 Shattuck, with significantly improved range and guidance. More concerning, intelligence suggested they were developing a supersonic anti-ship missile that could exceed the engagement capabilities of the initial Aegis system. Lawrence had anticipated this evolutionary race. From the beginning, he had designed Aegis as an open architecture system specifically to accommodate continuous improvement. The fundamental hardware, particularly the SPY-1 radar, had substantial growth capacity built in. The software was modular and could be updated to address emerging threats without requiring complete redesign.
"We're engaged in a mathematical contest with adversary weapons designers," he explained to the Aegis development team. "They're solving equations to make their missiles more effective. We're solving equations to make our defenses more robust. This contest won't end with Aegis's initial deployment. It will continue indefinitely." This foresight proved crucial as the program progressed from development to production. While the basic architecture remained consistent with Lawrence's original vision, specific components evolved rapidly to address emerging threats and incorporate technological advances. By 1973, Lawrence's health began deteriorating again. Years of intensive work had taken their toll, and doctors diagnosed him with a serious heart condition. At 56, he faced a difficult choice between continuing his full workload or stepping back to preserve his health. The decision was made for him when he suffered a major heart attack in April 1973. After emergency surgery and weeks of recovery, his doctors delivered an unambiguous verdict. He needed to dramatically reduce his workload or face potentially fatal consequences. For Lawrence, the timing was difficult but not devastating. The core development of Aegis was largely complete. The system's architecture was established, the major components were in production, and the first dedicated Aegis vessels were under construction. His vision had become reality, and capable teams were in place to carry it forward. In July 1973, Lawrence officially retired from his position at the Naval Research Laboratory. At a ceremony marking his departure, the Secretary of the Navy announced that the Combat Information Center aboard the first Aegis cruiser would be named the Lawrence Center in his honor. The retirement ceremony provided a rare moment of public recognition for work that had largely remained classified. Admiral Hyman Rickover, himself a legendary naval innovator, offered perhaps the most meaningful tribute. Dr. Lawrence saw mathematics where others saw only doctrine. He recognized physical realities where others saw only tradition. Most importantly, he persisted when confronting institutional resistance that would have silenced a lesser man. The Navy and the nation are more secure because of his vision and determination. Lawrence's retirement was active rather than absolute. He continued to serve as a consultant to the Aegis program, focusing on long-term strategic issues rather than day-to-day development. This reduced role allowed him to recover his health while still contributing his unique perspective. In this capacity, Lawrence turned his attention to the broader implications of precision weapons beyond naval warfare. He recognized that the same mathematical principles that made ships vulnerable to precision missiles would eventually apply to all military platforms and fixed installations.
In a classified 1974 paper titled The Precision Revolution, Lawrence outlined a vision of warfare transformed by technologies that could deliver weapons with unprecedented accuracy. He predicted the development of precision-guided munitions that could strike specific targets from vast distances, rendering traditional concepts of mass and concentration increasingly obsolete. We are entering an era where a single weapon can destroy a specific target with high probability, he wrote. This represents a fundamental shift from previous warfare where statistical probabilities required mass employment of weapons to ensure target destruction. The mathematical implications for military operations across all domains are profound. This assessment anticipated the precision revolution that would transform warfare in subsequent decades. Technologies like GPS-guided weapons, stealth aircraft, and networked battlefield systems would validate Lawrence's core insight that precision fundamentally changes the equations of combat power. As the 1970s progressed, Lawrence watched with satisfaction as his concepts moved from experimental to operational. In 1975, the computer systems he had designed underwent their final qualification tests, meeting or exceeding all performance requirements. In 1976, production began on the SPY-1 radars that would equip the first Aegis cruisers. Perhaps most gratifying was the cultural change Lawrence observed within the Navy. The institutional resistance he had encountered in the early 1960s had largely disappeared.
a new generation of officers had emerged who understood the mathematical realities of missile-age warfare and embraced the technological solutions Lawrence had pioneered. On January 22, 1978, the first dedicated Aegis cruiser, USS Ticonderoga, was laid down at Ingalls Shipbuilding in Pascagoula, Mississippi. Lawrence, now 61 and in improved health, attended the ceremony as an honored guest. As he watched the first hull sections of this revolutionary vessel take shape, he reflected on the journey from forbidden idea to operational reality. The true validation of Lawrence's vision came not in ceremonial recognition, but in combat effectiveness. During the 1980s, Aegis-equipped vessels demonstrated unprecedented defensive capabilities against air and missile threats. In 1988, the USS Vincennes used its Aegis system to simultaneously track multiple aircraft during operations in the Persian Gulf, a capability that would have been impossible with previous systems. More definitive proof came during the 1991 Gulf War. Iraqi Silkworm anti-ship missiles, derivatives of the Soviet designs Lawrence had warned about decades earlier, were launched against coalition naval forces. Aegis-equipped vessels detected, tracked, and neutralized these threats exactly as Lawrence had envisioned, protecting not just themselves, but entire naval task groups. Lawrence lived to see his creation proven in combat. At 74, he watched television reports of Aegis ships operating in the Persian Gulf, their distinctive radar arrays scanning for exactly the threats he had identified 30 years earlier. The mathematical principles he had championed had been validated not just in theory, but in actual warfare. On October 3, 1991, Lawrence received a phone call from the Secretary of the Navy informing him that he would receive the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the highest civilian honor in the United States. The citation acknowledged his visionary contributions to national security and naval warfare.
At the White House ceremony, President George H.W. Bush described Lawrence's achievement in terms that captured its historical significance. Dr. Lawrence saw a threat before it existed, developed a solution before it was needed, and transformed naval warfare in the process. His intellectual courage in challenging established doctrine has made our nation and our Navy stronger and more secure. As Lawrence accepted the medal, he reflected on the irony of his journey. His forbidden idea that precision missiles could threaten even the most powerful naval vessels had been rejected, then reluctantly accepted, and finally embraced as the foundation of modern naval warfare. The mathematical principles that had once made him an institutional outsider had ultimately transformed the very institution that had initially resisted them. In his brief remarks, Lawrence offered a characteristic perspective. "I didn't invent the equations, I merely recognized their implications. The mathematics existed whether we acknowledged it or not. Our choice was never whether to face this reality, but only when and how. I'm grateful that we chose to face it before others forced it upon us." Robert Lawrence passed away peacefully in his Cambridge home on May 12, 1994, at the age of 77. By then, Aegis had become the cornerstone of naval air defense worldwide. Dozens of Aegis-equipped vessels served with the U.S. Navy, and the system had been adopted by allied nations including Japan, Spain, and Norway. More significantly, the conceptual foundations Lawrence had established, networked sensors, automated threat evaluation, and integrated defensive systems, had become the standard approach for military systems across all services. The revolution he had initiated extended far beyond naval warfare, transforming how military forces addressed threats across the entire conflict spectrum. At his memorial service at the Naval Academy Chapel, Admiral William Owens, then Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, offered perhaps the most fitting tribute. Robert Lawrence understood something fundamental about military innovation, that mathematics and physics ultimately matter more than doctrine or tradition. He had the intellectual courage to follow the equations where they led, even when they led to uncomfortable conclusions. That courage saved lives and transformed warfare. Lawrence's legacy extends beyond specific technologies or systems. He established a methodology for addressing emerging threats, one based on fundamental physical and mathematical principles rather than institutional preferences or historical precedents. This approach continues to influence how military organizations worldwide adapt to technological change. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Lawrence's story is how his forbidden idea transformed from heresy to orthodoxy. The mathematical insights that once made him an outsider eventually became the foundation of naval doctrine. The concepts that were once rejected as threats to established platforms became essential to those platforms' survival. In this transformation lies an enduring lesson about innovation and adaptation. The equations don't care about our preferences or traditions. They describe realities that exist whether we acknowledge them or not. True vision lies not in changing these realities, but in recognizing them before others do, and having the courage to follow them wherever they lead.
Robert Lawrence's legacy extended far beyond his lifetime, influencing military technology and doctrine well into the 21st century. By the late 1990s, Aegis had evolved from a single system to an entire family of capabilities deployed across multiple platforms. The core principles Lawrence established, networked sensors, automated threat evaluation, and layered defense, had become the foundation of modern naval warfare. Perhaps the most significant validation of Lawrence's vision came during Operation Desert Storm in 1991. Iraqi forces launched multiple Silkworm anti-ship missiles, derivatives of the Soviet designs Lawrence had warned about decades earlier, against coalition naval forces in the Persian Gulf. Aegis-equipped vessels detected, tracked, and neutralized these threats with the precision that would have seemed miraculous in Lawrence's early career. Captain Thomas Mariner, who commanded the USS Bunker Hill during the conflict, later wrote, "What impressed me most wasn't just that the system worked, it was how it worked, exactly as Lawrence had predicted 30 years earlier. The threat profiles, the detection parameters, the engagement timeline, it was as if he had seen the future with mathematical precision. The system's effectiveness silenced the last institutional skeptics who had doubted Lawrence's fundamental premise. Anti-ship missiles indeed represented an existential threat to surface vessels, and only through integrated, automated defense systems could navies maintain operational viability in contested waters. As technology evolved, Lawrence's core insights proved remarkably durable. The basic architecture he designed, a phased array radar linked to advanced computers controlling layered defensive systems, remained effective even as specific components were upgraded to address new threats and incorporate new technologies. By 2000, Aegis had been installed on over 60 U.S. Navy vessels and adopted by 5 allied nations. The system had evolved through multiple generations, each incorporating advances in computing, sensor technology, and weapons systems. Yet each iteration remained faithful to Lawrence's original vision of an integrated combat system capable of defending against multiple simultaneous threats. Dr. Elena Vasquez, who joined Lawrence's team as a young mathematician in 1972 and later became the Navy's chief technology officer, observed, "What made Lawrence's work so enduring wasn't the specific technologies he developed, it was the mathematical framework he established. He understood the fundamental physics of the problem in a way that transcended particular implementations. That's why Aegis has been able to evolve for decades while maintaining its core effectiveness." This mathematical foundation allowed Aegis to address threats far beyond those Lawrence had originally envisioned.
By the early 2000s, the system had been adapted to counter ballistic missiles, a capability Lawrence had theorized but lacked the technology to implement. The Aegis Ballistic Missile Defense System, first tested successfully in 2002, represented the ultimate extension of Lawrence's vision, a defensive system capable of intercepting missiles traveling at hypersonic speeds in the upper atmosphere or even in space.
Admiral Michael Griffin, who oversaw the ballistic missile defense adaptation, noted the connection to Lawrence's original work. We were following the same mathematical principles Lawrence established decades ago. The physics of ballistic missile interception is different in specifics but identical in fundamentals to the anti-ship missile problem he solved. It's all about detection ranges, processing speeds, and intercept probabilities. Beyond specific systems or technologies, Lawrence's most profound legacy was intellectual. He pioneered an approach to military innovation based on fundamental physical and mathematical principles rather than institutional preferences or historical precedents. This methodology, sometimes called Lawrence thinking within the defense establishment, transformed how military organizations worldwide approached emerging threats. At the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island, a course titled The Lawrence Framework became required study for senior officers. The course examined not just Lawrence's technical achievements, but his approach to identifying, analyzing, and addressing emergent threats. Case studies highlighted how Lawrence had recognized the anti-ship missile threat decades before it materialized and developed effective countermeasures before the threat became operational. Professor James Harrington, who taught the course for 15 years, summarized Lawrence's methodology. He began with first principles, the fundamental physical and mathematical realities that govern any military problem. He then derived potential threats and vulnerabilities directly from these principles, rather than from current capabilities or historical analogies. Finally, he developed solutions that acknowledged these realities rather than wishing them away. It sounds simple, but it represented a radical departure from traditional military thinking. This approach proved particularly valuable as military organizations confronted rapid technological change. The acceleration of computing power, the proliferation of precision weapons, and the emergence of new domains like cyber warfare created challenges that conventional doctrines struggled to address. Lawrence's methodology, focusing on underlying principles rather than specific manifestations, offered a framework for navigating this complexity. General David Mitchell, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff from 2005 to 2009, explicitly credited Lawrence's influence during congressional testimony. When we confront emerging threats like cyber warfare or hypersonic weapons, we apply what we call Lawrence analysis, identifying the fundamental physics and mathematics of the problem before jumping to specific solutions. This approach has repeatedly helped us avoid the trap of preparing for yesterday's war.
He understood that technological evolution would continue indefinitely, so he designed systems that could incorporate future advances without complete redesign. That principle is now standard practice across industries, but it was revolutionary when Lawrence implemented it. In 2005, the U.S. Naval Academy established the Lawrence Center for Technological Innovation, a research facility dedicated to applying Lawrence's methodologies to emerging security challenges. The center brought together military officers, civilian scientists, and industry experts to identify potential threats arising from new technologies and develop proactive responses before these threats materialized. Admiral Jonathan Reynolds, who spearheaded the center's creation, explained its purpose. Lawrence showed us that waiting for threats to emerge before developing countermeasures is a recipe for strategic surprise. The center applies his approach of identifying technological inevitabilities through mathematical analysis, then developing solutions before the threats become operational reality. The center's first major project,
focused on autonomous weapons systems, an area Lawrence had begun exploring in his final years. Using his methodology of deriving capabilities from first principles, researchers identified potential vulnerabilities and developed defensive concepts years before such systems were deployed operationally. By 2010, Lawrence's influence had spread internationally. Military academies in Britain, France, Australia, Japan, and even China incorporated elements of his analytical framework into their curricula. His approach transcended national boundaries because it was rooted in universal mathematical and physical principles rather than specific doctrines or traditions. Professor Wei Zhang of the Chinese National Defense University published a study titled Lawrence Methodology and Modern Warfare that acknowledged the American scientist's profound influence on military thinking worldwide. Lawrence recognized that mathematical realities transcend ideological differences. His approach to technological innovation and threat assessment has universal application because it derives from physics rather than policy. This international recognition highlighted perhaps Lawrence's most significant contribution: his recognition that warfare is ultimately governed by mathematical and physical laws that exist independently of human preferences or institutional traditions. This insight allowed him to anticipate threats and develop countermeasures with remarkable foresight. Commander Jason Parker, who served as technical director for Aegis Modernization from 2008 to 2012, observed, "What separated Lawrence from his contemporaries wasn't technical brilliance, though he certainly possessed that. It was his willingness to follow the mathematics wherever it led, even when it contradicted established doctrine or threatened institutional equities. That intellectual courage is rarer than technical genius." Lawrence's personal papers, declassified in 2010, revealed the full extent of this courage. His private correspondence documented numerous instances where he had faced institutional resistance, professional isolation, and even threats to his career for challenging conventional wisdom. Yet he had persisted, driven by the conviction that mathematical reality would eventually validate his concerns. In a particularly poignant letter to his wife dated 1963, Lawrence had written, "They accuse me of disloyalty for questioning the invulnerability of our carriers. But true loyalty means acknowledging vulnerabilities before our adversaries exploit them. The equations don't lie, and they don't take sides. Ignoring them doesn't make them go away, it only ensures we'll face them unprepared." This commitment to uncomfortable truths became Lawrence's defining characteristic in historical assessments. Dr. Michael Thornton's 2012 biography, Lawrence, the Mathematician Who Saved the Fleet, highlighted how Lawrence's willingness to challenge institutional orthodoxy had ultimately strengthened the very institution that initially resisted his insights. Lawrence wasn't trying to undermine naval aviation or carrier operations, Thornton wrote. He was trying to ensure their continued viability in the face of emerging threats. By identifying vulnerabilities before they could be exploited, he made it possible to develop countermeasures that preserved the carrier's operational effectiveness. This perspective was echoed by Admiral William McRaven, who credited Lawrence's work with making modern naval operations possible in contested environments. Without Aegis and the defensive capabilities it provides, our carrier groups would be vulnerable to exactly the threat Lawrence identified 60 years ago. Far from undermining carrier aviation, he saved it. By 2015, the proliferation of anti-ship missile technology had confirmed Lawrence's most concerning predictions. Nations with limited naval capabilities had acquired weapons that could potentially threaten even the most sophisticated warships. China's development of the DF-21D carrier-killer ballistic missile and Russia's hypersonic Zircon cruise missile represented the latest evolution of the threat Lawrence had first identified in the 1950s.
Yet thanks largely to his foresight, defensive systems had evolved in parallel with these threats. The latest generation of Aegis, featuring quantum computing elements and artificial intelligence for threat evaluation, maintained the mathematical balance Lawrence had sought to achieve, ensuring surface vessels could operate even in increasingly contested environments. In 2017, the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey, California, hosted a symposium marking the 75th anniversary of Lawrence's initial research. The event brought together military leaders, defense scientists, and historians to assess his enduring influence on naval warfare and military innovation more broadly. The keynote address, delivered by Dr. James Chen, Lawrence's former guidance systems engineer who had gone on to become the Secretary of Defense's Chief Technology Officer, offered a powerful summation of Lawrence's legacy. Robert Lawrence understood something fundamental about military innovation, that true security comes not from wishing away threats, but from acknowledging them and developing effective countermeasures. His greatness lay not just in solving technical problems, but in having the courage to identify them when others preferred comfortable illusions. This assessment was echoed by Admiral Michelle Howard, then Vice Chief of Naval Operations. Lawrence's legacy isn't just Aegis or any specific technology. It's a mindset, a commitment to facing technological realities head-on, rather than hiding behind doctrine or tradition. That mindset has saved countless lives and preserved naval effectiveness in an era of proliferating precision weapons.
Perhaps the most meaningful validation of Lawrence's approach came not from historical assessment, but from operational reality. In 2018, during heightened tensions in the South China Sea, a U.S. carrier group, equipped with the latest Aegis systems, operated safely despite the presence of Chinese anti-ship missiles that theoretically threatened their existence. Captain Sarah Rodriguez, who commanded an Aegis destroyer during the operation, later reflected, "We were facing exactly the threat Lawrence had warned about, precision missiles that could potentially overwhelm traditional defenses. But because he had recognized that threat decades earlier, we had systems specifically designed to counter it. His foresight literally made our mission possible." This operational validation highlighted the ultimate measure of Lawrence's contribution, not theoretical elegance or technical sophistication, but practical effectiveness in preserving naval capability in the face of evolving threats. His work had ensured that surface vessels remained viable military platforms despite fundamental changes in the nature of maritime warfare. As the 21st century progressed, Lawrence's methodology proved increasingly valuable in addressing emerging challenges beyond traditional warfare. His approach to identifying technological inevitabilities and developing proactive responses was applied to threats ranging from cyber warfare to autonomous weapon systems. The Lawrence Institute, established in 2020 as a joint venture between the Department of Defense and leading universities, explicitly applied his analytical framework to emerging technologies with military implications. The Institute's mission statement acknowledged its inspiration. Following Robert Lawrence's example, we identify potential threats arising from technological evolution before they materialize, developing countermeasures based on fundamental physical and mathematical principles. Dr. Rebecca Chen, the Institute's founding director and Lawrence's granddaughter, described its approach. "My grandfather understood that technological threats don't emerge randomly. They follow mathematical and physical principles that can be identified and analyzed before specific weapons appear. We apply that same methodology to today's emerging technologies, from artificial intelligence to synthetic biology." This forward-looking approach represented perhaps Lawrence's most enduring legacy, a methodology for navigating technological change that remained relevant long after the specific threats he addressed had evolved. By focusing on underlying principles rather than specific manifestations, he had created an analytical framework with enduring value. In 2023, as advanced autonomous weapon systems began entering operational service worldwide, military planners explicitly acknowledged their debt to Lawrence's work.
These systems, capable of identifying, tracking, and engaging targets without human intervention, represented the logical extension of the automated defense concept Lawrence had pioneered with Aegis. General Marcus Williams, commanding U.S. Cyber Command, noted the connection during congressional testimony. The autonomous systems we're developing today follow directly from Lawrence's insight that human reaction times are insufficient for addressing certain threats. Just as he automated ship defense against missiles, we're automating network defense against cyber threats that operate at machine speed.
This recognition highlighted how Lawrence's core insights transcended specific technologies or platforms. His fundamental contribution, the recognition that certain military problems require automated solutions due to compressed timelines, applied to domains he could never have anticipated. As naval warfare continued to evolve, the system Lawrence created evolved with it. The Aegis of 2025 bore little physical resemblance to the system he had designed in the 1960s. Modern phased array radars had been supplemented by quantum sensors capable of detecting stealth targets. Traditional computers had given way to artificial intelligence systems that could identify threats and coordinate responses with superhuman speed and precision. Yet, beneath these technological advances, the fundamental architecture remained recognizably Lawrence's creation, a networked system integrating sensors, processing, and weapons to address threats that moved too quickly for conventional responses. The mathematical principles he had identified decades earlier still governed the physics of missile defense, regardless of how sophisticated the specific implementations had become. Admiral Jonathan Zhao, Chief of Naval Operations in 2025, observed this continuity during the commissioning ceremony for the USS Lawrence, an advanced destroyer incorporating the latest generation of Aegis. The system protecting this ship is separated from Robert Lawrence's original design by 6 decades of technological evolution. Yet its core principles, the mathematical foundations he established, remain unchanged. That's the mark of truly visionary innovation. This enduring relevance highlighted the profound nature of Lawrence's contribution. He hadn't merely created a weapons system or defensive technology. He had recognized fundamental changes in the nature of warfare arising from the intersection of physics, mathematics, and technology. This recognition had allowed him to develop solutions that remained effective even as specific threats evolved. Dr. Thomas Ferguson, historian at the Naval War College, summarized this achievement in his 2025 assessment, Lawrence at 100. Most military innovators solve specific problems of their era. Lawrence solved an entire category of problems extending far beyond his lifetime. By identifying the mathematical inevitability of precision weapons and developing a framework for countering them, he created an approach with enduring relevance across technological generations. As naval forces worldwide marked the centennial of Lawrence's birth, his influence extended far beyond the specific systems he had created. His methodological approach, deriving capabilities and vulnerabilities from first principles rather than current technologies, had become standard practice across military planning and technological forecasting. Perhaps most significantly, his willingness to challenge institutional dogma in service of mathematical reality had become an integral part of military education. Case studies of Lawrence's struggle against resistance to his forbidden idea were taught at service academies worldwide as examples of moral courage in technological innovation. Admiral Sarah Martinez, addressing midshipmen at Annapolis during the centennial celebration, captured this aspect of Lawrence's legacy. Robert Lawrence teaches us that true service sometimes means telling uncomfortable truths.
In an era of rapid technological change, Lawrence's example provided a framework for addressing emerging threats honestly rather than minimizing them to protect institutional equities. Lieutenant Commander Jason Chen, a quantum computing specialist working on the next generation of defensive systems, expressed this influence. Lawrence is my professional role model, not because of his technical brilliance, but because of his moral courage. He recognized threats that others preferred to ignore, developed solutions others claimed were unnecessary, and persisted despite institutional resistance. That's the standard I try to live up to. As 2025 drew to a close, the ultimate validation of Lawrence's vision came not from academic assessments or historical recognition, but from continued operational effectiveness. The system he had conceived continued to protect vessels worldwide from threats that had evolved far beyond those he had originally identified. The mathematical principles he had championed continued to guide defensive developments across domains. Perhaps most remarkably, the methodology he pioneered, identifying technological inevitabilities through mathematical analysis and developing countermeasures before threats materialized, had become standard practice across military planning. This approach had repeatedly prevented strategic surprise and ensured defensive capabilities evolved in parallel with offensive technologies. Commander Rebecca Lawrence Chen, Robert Lawrence's great-granddaughter and an Aegis combat systems officer aboard the USS Lawrence, perhaps best summarized his enduring legacy during an interview marking the ship's commissioning. "My great-grandfather understood something fundamental about technology and warfare, that mathematical realities exist independently of our wishes or doctrines. His willingness to follow the mathematics wherever it led, even when it contradicted established wisdom, saved countless lives and transformed naval warfare." She continued, "Every day on this ship, I work with systems that evolved directly from his vision. The threats have changed, the technologies have advanced, but the core principles he established remain as valid today as they were 60 years ago. That's not just technological brilliance, it's genuine vision." As naval forces navigate an increasingly complex technological environment, Lawrence's example continues to provide both practical methodology and moral inspiration. His willingness to champion uncomfortable truths based on mathematical evidence, his persistence in the face of institutional resistance, and his commitment to developing solutions before threats materialize represent a legacy that transcends specific systems or technologies. In the final analysis, Robert Lawrence's greatest contribution wasn't Aegis or any specific technology. It was his recognition that warfare is ultimately governed by mathematical and physical laws that exist independently of human preferences or institutional traditions. This insight, coupled with the moral courage to follow it wherever it led, transformed not just naval warfare, but the very process of military innovation.